books, Children and God, and that's one of the courses also that she taught at the summer school here this year as well. So welcome Mary, Ruth, and Loren.
It's no secret that education is in a kind of crisis condition today, and our discussion this morning has, I think, reflected that. This really should be no great surprise to us. And I'm going to have to apologize here to some of the people who have been in the courses this week, because I'll make some references and some quotations you've already heard, but they're all good, so it won't hurt to hear them twice. It shouldn't be surprised that education is in a crisis condition, because our culture in general is in a kind of crisis condition. The great Irish poet William Butler Yeats described the 20th century in a kind of prophetic poem written just after World War I. Turning in a widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passion and intensity. It was written 70 years ago, but it does seem to be more descriptive of today's society than it was even then. And as the world has gotten more and more confusing and difficult, the institutions which prepare us for life in it have become more and more in danger and threatened and confused as to how to deal with that difficulty. The family has certainly been pressured and on the wane. Family has even been denounced by some as itself a repressive institution imposed by cultural conservatives on people of different social and sexual orientation. And you've perhaps heard this sort of criticism of the family. The church, or religious faith, any religious faith in general, has been marginalized, kept alive, or allowed for in, let's say, the Charter of Rights, but completely privatized, pushed out of the public realm and into the private realm, so that it can or should have no particular role to play in, for example, education. And we've referred to that this morning, that the inability of a teacher to talk directly about his or her religious faith in schools. Schools, which once were understood to prepare a person for life in a society which knew what it was about as a society, now can't talk about the purpose of society ultimately, because that will involve talking about the ultimate purpose of human life. And to talk about that in any meaningful way will be interfering with the freedom of religion. So we can't talk in religious terms about human purpose or social purpose, and thus the purpose, or the Greek word that's useful here, the telos of human life and of social life, is left very vague. If there isn't an overall purpose, it's hard to see how individual education, specific education, fits in. So education at all levels has really shrunk to two kinds of activity. On the one hand, there is help provided and discussion provided, and much of the material in the teachers' manuals, as I read it, refers to this sort of thing. There's help provided in choosing and clarifying values. But values are understood to be not to refer to anything ultimate, but to be private. Values are to be chosen carefully with reference to only one standard, and that's freedom. One ought to be free to choose one's values, and thus some of the guiding material in the curricula, in the resource material, gives students directions as to how to think through their values. But there's no reference to any overarching source of those values, because that involves the religious, and the religious is a private matter. So that's about the only way in which value discussion can go on in schools today. The other major subject matter for schools, of course, is simply providing instruction in techniques for getting things done, for reading, writing, arithmetic, augmented in all sorts of interesting ways by TV and videos and computers. And of course those things, learning those things, introduce a whole other level of things to be learned and techniques to be mastered in school. But what is missing in education as a whole is a sense of what Aristotle called the telos, or the end, or the goal of human life. The prevailing worldview of the culture, which is a kind of scientific materialism which can only affirm that we're the products of a cosmic accident, effectively prohibits any serious discussion of who and what and why we are. And though we're talking primarily about education at younger levels, the lower levels, it's worth noting that this problem of teaching only techniques rather than the ultimate end to which those techniques are applied, the problem, we could almost put it, the problem of training, schools providing training rather than education, happens at the highest levels of professional training as well. In fact, training teachers, you're trained in techniques of teaching, but not perhaps so much in the ultimate goal of teaching, which is the formation of human beings. I'm not sure, and you should talk to me about the kind of curriculum, the nature of your curriculum, those of you who are teachers. But I'm drawing on analogies with other curricula I know something about. I mentioned earlier this week the observation of a lawyer friend of mine that justice is not a part of the curriculum of contemporary lawyers. There is an elective course in most law schools on jurisprudence, which is really the nature of justice and the history of ideas of justice, but hardly anybody takes it, maybe 3 or 4 people in the course. Young lawyers who bring discussions of justice as the goal of the legal profession are laughed at as idealists. Legal training, legal education has become a matter of legal training, which is the handling and manipulating of various legal techniques to operate within the current legal system. But the overall question of justice and what it is sidestepped, because ultimately it's at least a philosophical, if not a religious or spiritual concept. A similar complaint comes from medical students and critics of the medical profession. The array of techniques for dealing with the body as a kind of machine have increased dramatically. And at the same time, our knowledge of the complex biochemical workings of the body, and we're more and more able to manipulate those things. But there's not much room in the medical curriculum for the discussion of health. And health is almost comparable to the idea of justice for the lawyer. Much less happiness, which takes us right out of the realm of medical technology and into the realm of religion or philosophy. It's even a problem in theological schools where I teach. It's much easier to teach techniques of reading Greek or Hebrew, exegeting the Bible, getting to the meaning of the text, sorting out theological principles, than it is to deepen a person's knowledge of God, which is the ultimate purpose of that. So the concern with technique involves us at every level, I think. Well, this is clearly an intolerable situation. And there have been and are all sorts of reactions against it. There is a determined effort at almost every level of education by at least some people to recover some kind of wholeness, some kind of transcendent framework into which these various technologies that we teach and learn and practice can be fitted. Everybody's concerned about this. Everybody recognizes that learning, training, and technique is not enough. And so there's a lot of talk about values and ethics in education at all levels. All sorts of professional schools, again I'm talking at a higher level, are offering courses in ethics. Medical ethics, legal ethics, business ethics. But it's kind of like a dessert. It's kind of like a frosting on the cake, and it's not related. And it doesn't seem to help much. Because the prevailing understanding of ethics is that once again, values are a private matter, individually chosen. To say anything else is to imply uncomfortable and culturally unacceptable things about the nature of right and wrong in an absolute sense. I recall here the first chapter of C.S. Lewis's book, Mere Christianity, which is titled Right and Wrong as a Clue to the Meaning of the Universe. And if you haven't read that chapter, I recommend it. Because once you start talking about right and wrong, you're getting into religious questions. And it's difficult to talk about ethics, to teach ethics, without talking about right and wrong. And yet there is an attempt to teach ethics today within the framework of a purely private conception of values. And it just won't work. Alistair MacIntyre, in a very important book called After Virtue, and MacIntyre was a philosopher, he's a philosopher, describes the difficulty of any significant moral discourse, any significant talk about ethics today. He describes a society, I read this the other night, so you'll remember this example. He opens his book, After Virtue, with a description of a hypothetical society in which there's been a determined reaction against science, an attempt to wipe it out. People have been fed up with science. They've tried to get rid of it. They've killed scientists. They've burned books. They've tried to wipe out the tradition. Till only little bits and pieces of science, the whole tradition of science, survive. Later, people recognize the unwisdom of that reaction against science, and they try to rebuild it. And they can find little bits and pieces of scientific language and fragments of apparatus and experiments and so forth, and they use the language, but the overarching framework of scientific discourse in which it all fit together is gone. Now, what MacIntyre argues is that the moral world is like that today. We have, as a culture, effectively rebelled against the framework that makes moral discourse possible, and that's a religious framework. We've excluded it. We've excluded it from our schools, for example. And now that we recognize that we need a moral framework, we need to be able to talk about ethics, we're trying to reproduce it, but we can't, at least not within the sort of eviscerated understanding of ethics as a private matter only. So MacIntyre moves from his analogy of an anti-science society to an anti-religion society this way. The hypothesis which I wish to advance is that in the actual world which we inhabit, the language of morality is in the same state of grave disorder as the language of natural science in the imaginary world which I described. What we possess, if this view is true, are the fragments of a conceptual scheme, parts which now lack those contexts from which their significance derived. We have very largely, if not entirely, lost our comprehension, both theoretical and practical, of morality. Now, what does all of this have to do with the impressions curriculum and with teaching in general on the elementary levels? Before saying a few things about it, let me read another passage from near the conclusion of this same book, After Virtue, which talks about the disappearance of a moral possibility of a framework for moral discourse in our culture. Again, some of you have heard this before, but it's very much to the point. Man in his actions and practice, as well as in his fictions, is essentially a storytelling animal. He is not essentially, but becomes through his history, a teller of stories that aspire to truth. But the key question for men is not about their own authorship. I can only answer the question, what am I to do, if I can answer the prior question of what story or stories do I find myself a part? We enter human society, that is, with one or more imputed characters, roles into which we have been drafted. And we have to learn what they are in order to be able to understand how others respond to us and how our responses to them are apt to be construed. It is through hearing stories about wicked stepmothers, lost children, good but misguided kings, wolves that suckle twin boys, youngest sons who receive no inheritance but must make their own way in the world, and eldest sons who waste their inheritance on riotous living and go into exile to live with the swine, that children learn or mislearn both what a child and what a parent is, what the cast of characters may be in the drama into which they've been born, and what the ways of the world are. It's not irrelevant to this discussion, by the way, to point out that shortly after writing this book, MacIntyre, who had all his professional distinguished academic life functioned as out of a framework of a sort of academic Marxism, realized the bankruptcy of that and all other frameworks and became a professing Christian as an older man. He was convinced that of all the stories which have given purpose and meaning to human life, the one that was most firmly rooted in truth and in history was the Christian story. G.K. Chesterton describes in his autobiography the importance of fairy tales in his own education. You read a couple of passages from this book, Orthodoxy, that I quoted from before this week. There is the lesson of Cinderella, which is the same as that of the Magnificat, that the humble will be exalted. There is the great lesson of Beauty and the Beast, that a thing must be loved before it is lovable. There is the terrible allegory of the Sleeping Beauty, which tells how the human creature was blessed with all birthday gifts, yet cursed with death, and how death also may perhaps be softened to a sleep. And also about fairy tales in general. And let me point out, the world of fairy tales that he's describing is what some of you would suggest is the world of the occult in these stories. That is, any reference to anything supernatural has been labeled occult and linked, I think perhaps too hastily, with the practice of witchcraft, which is only one small aspect, and in our society, I think a very perverted one, of the world, the sort of past world of the supernatural that people are trying to rediscover. In the fairy tale, an incomprehensible happiness rests upon an incomprehensible condition. A box is opened and all evils fly out. A word is forgotten and cities perish. A lamp is lit and love flies away. A flower is plucked and human lives are forfeited. An apple is eaten and the hope of God is gone. Which brings me very specifically to the Impressionist curriculum. The first thing to say about it is that it too is a reaction against the kind of purposeless dead end that has increasingly trapped education, or that's trapped our whole culture. The feeling that all we have to learn are techniques with nothing to do with them, no overarching sense of purpose. This curriculum and other contemporary curricula that draw from the body, the rich body of the best of human imaginative work, literature, tradition. It's an attempt to break out of this idea that education is value-free training for performing various skills in a society that doesn't know what its purpose is. And so it opens a variety of doors into worlds where people had a clear idea of what human life was about. It ransacks the world's literature and mythology, both past and present, and takes the best of its imaginative literature and makes that the subject for learning how to read. And I think the instinct is very good there. To continue that quote from MacIntyre, "Deprive children of stories," he said, "and you leave them unscripted, anxious stutterers in their actions as in their words. Hence there is no way to give us an understanding of any society, including our own, except through the stock of stories which constitute its initial dramatic resources. Mythology, in its original sense, is at the heart of things. That moral tradition is right from heroic society to its medieval heirs, according to which the telling of stories has a key part in educating us into the virtues, is into the whole nature of what morality is about. Stories are one of the ways to communicate that. And thus the great danger and the great promise of this curriculum or any other in this culture at this time. Because these stories powerfully open the door onto the moral world, a world where right and wrong is real and things matter. Far more, I suspect, than Saturday morning cartoons, where the only thing that matters is whether you buy Sugar Crisp. It's a frightening and it's a fragile world of real good and real evil. And it embodies the fact that we live in a moral universe where freedom is not the only value. But more often than not, I mean, that's the good part of the curriculum. The bad part, the dangerous part, is that the stories are being used by teachers who sometimes, I think increasingly often, have an inadequate understanding of what it means to be a human being. A human being with an immortal soul, with choices, making real choices of a real right and real wrong. And thus they sometimes don't know what to do with these stories. And they are, as I suggested, like themselves like children being given swords to play with. And they can cut themselves. And yet, I think the best solution is not to get rid of these stories for all of their potential danger. And again, I suspect, I urge those of you who've been very critical of these stories to sit down with any one of these books and read through one of them. If you've done that, then you have a more solid basis for criticizing them. Criticize this curriculum on the basis of these books, not what you've heard about it or what other people have said about it. It's the only way you can do it, and then we can talk. I guess I'll conclude by this, that works of imagination, from poetry to novels to fairy tales, don't just train us to do things more efficiently as human beings, but they give us more to be human beings with. And I think it would be very unfortunate if we as Christians were responsible for closing these dangerous but life-giving doors.
So frustrating. I wish all of you could have been in the course. I wish I could have all of you back in Vancouver for several weeks and talk with you about children's literature. I think one of the sad things is that it's become a big bugaboo. It's become a great source of fear, and I can't take care of those fears. I know, because I have been a parent myself, how scary it is. Everything all of a sudden is seen in its eternal dimensions, and that's scary. But it's absolutely true, too. Everything that happens to our child, everything that happens to us, does have eternal dimensions. And what I would say is that it's precisely because of that I did give my children stories of witches, goblins, and ghosts, and had very stepmothers. But mixed in with all of those bad guys were the good guys that all these fairy stories have too. You can't have in our own stories the thief or the shepherd guarding his sheep without the thief that's about to take them away. And if we try to tell our children that the story only involves a shepherd, we'll have cut them off from something that's very, very important for them to know. And that is that that story has a thief in it too. We'll have been doing them a gross injustice. So I'm going to try to condense some of what I would like to say. And I will start off by mentioning some books that I would like you to read. And that's because I'm not going to have time to say. I have to stop in 18 minutes, and I'm not going to have time to say everything that I would like to say. And I want you to have time to say what you like to say. But I would like you to read this book, Catherine Patterson's Gates of Excellence. It's really a bunch of reviews, 2 books that she has been asked to review, and also Newbery Award speeches for the awards that she has received for her books, her National Book Award. Catherine Patterson is the wife of a Presbyterian minister. She makes no bones whatsoever about the fact that she is a Christian, that this is very important, that her kids pray before they go to bed every night. That it permeates the whole book. But she has twice won the Newbery Award. She has twice won the National Book Award in the States. She is always being quoted by people in the Horn Book, which is the best source of knowledge about children's literature. And her selections are through all of the curriculum. And they have been criticized because the person, in one place she describes the mother of this girl, Gilly Hopkins, as a goddess of perpetual perfection. And so that is criticized in the list of criticisms of the book, because no child should know what that means, and it brings in how the goddesses and things like that. Actually, it was a negative term for her mother. It indicated a mother, Gilly Hopkins' mother, had left her at a very early age. She had left her to be brought up by people whom she didn't even know, a foster parent. And she was, for Gilly, that goddess of perpetual perfection, because she didn't know her mother. She didn't know that her mother had left her. Her mother was a 60s flower child, and she had had the child and then found it too difficult to maintain the daily duties, and so had walked off. And we don't get that in the criticisms. We wouldn't get that unless we read the whole book. But what I think is wonderful, and where I would defend even the short selection, the anthologizing that inevitably can't include in one volume the whole of the great Gilly Hopkins and the whole of Bridge to Barabithia and all the other good books that she's written. What they have done is pick the most exciting part, the part that will whet that child's appetite and get him wanting to read more. And hopefully the child will read more. And in fact, that's the best thing that he can do, and that's in fact what most children are doing when their appetites are being whetted by this literature. She has quite a defense of the fairy tales in particular in this book. And she talks about the fact that our children, the children in our society, are very much burdened. But she says they're not unique in being burdened. All children everywhere have been burdened. Because as Christians, we believe that children are born into, as fallen creatures, a knowledge of good and evil. As adults, we can put everything in pegs. We can say we understand things. But children are coming to terms in very deep, deep ways with the fact that there is good and there is evil in the world. And she feels that it's very important to give children fairy tales just because of that. She says we Christians have done a lot of preaching about sin, much of it incomprehensible and much of it doing nothing except laying on guilt and despair. Part of this, I believe, is because rational argument rarely convinces sinners and never saves them. But the other part is that everybody talking about hell ain't been there, to paraphrase a spiritual. Unlike our Lord, we have not been able or willing to descend into hell. So our words of grace seep out bland and bloodless. Perhaps this is why the tax collectors and harlots are closer to the kingdom of heaven than we are. But those of us who have followed Frodo and Frodo is the main character in a long trilogy by Tolkien called The Lord of the Rings. And he draws from all of the history of fantastical fairy tale literature. Tolkien does in writing his book. Those of us who have followed Frodo on his quest have had a vision of the true darkness. We know that we, like him, would never have gotten up the steep slope of Mount Doom had the faithful Sam not flung us on his back and carried us up crawling at the last. We know, too, that we would never have parted with the baneful ring of power had not the piteous Gollum torn it from our bleeding finger and in the effort fallen screeching into the abyss, clutching his damned treasure and ours. When we read fiction that is true, and she's referring here to fairy tales that are deeply true, not fictional, not historically true. When we read the fiction that is true, we do not say, "There, but for the grace of God go I," but rather, "Here am I." For in such writing, we recognize our naked selves with a shudder, or laugh, sometimes quite wonderfully, with both. So fantasy, the goblins, the ghosts, the headless monsters, all of these things that go bump in the night are really part of history's expression of the fears that we all face. These fears cannot be dealt with on a rational level, just because they're not rational. These are really spiritual fears. They're not historical fears for the most part. Our fear of the bomb may be an historical fear, but it's very much an irrational fear of anything that we know can ruin and warp our soul. So when we read, for instance, that the princess wins out in George MacDonald, and he is one of our Christian roots, by the way. George MacDonald is the person upon whom C.S. Lewis has drawn very thoroughly. He is, many of you have probably met him in the Bethany House stories that he's written that are sort of historical fiction. And two of his most famous books are The Princess and the Goblin and The Princess and the Curdy. And The Princess and the Goblin is all about this young princess who meets these goblins. And in the end, some of the goblins get converted, and some just go probably to hell. And at the end of the story, also the children interact with the author, and they say, "Well, we want to hear more about dragons." Probably very typical of children. But in that book, when the princess wins out over the goblins, or in the story of St. George and the Dragon, which I have that book actually on the ledge behind our toilet. And I keep it there because I have this wonderful picture of St. George vanquishing the dragon with his sword. And we had that over the toilet. Now there's a disadvantage for women there because they don't really look at those things behind the toilet very much. But I've always felt that that was a wonderful sort of capturing of what it is like to face the day. Think of yourself as George, St. George going out to face your dragon. And so when he vanquishes the dragon, we really have a victory indeed. The victory is not just over dragons or goblins, as the case may be. That's just a prefiguring of it. It's a little insight into that struggle that we face every day, that we get in these tales. But our struggle, as St. George's was, as the princess's is over the darkness that is very much part of our world, and that in fact has given us all our fears in facing this kind of literature. And those are very real fears. So what we're really dealing with when we read St. George and the Dragon, it's not so much a dragon that's out there even. It's a dragon that, if we're all honest, we know is in here. Another writer, and this is from a book called Room to Remember, and it's by Friedrich Fichtner, who is a Christian writer, and he is a Presbyterian minister. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to pick on Presbyterians, but somehow both of these people managed to be Presbyterian. He writes about how there does seem in our society to be a real yin have stories about goblins. He says children love stories about goblins and demons. And he says that one of the reasons he feels this happens is that in a macadamized shopping center IBM civilization, reading about such things is one of the few wilderness areas left. It's one of the few places where we can meet these evils that we all know exist head on. And he says that, he said, answers his own question here. Is it a bad thing, literally, psychologically, humanly? Who knows? It seems at least an understandable thing. Violence in the streets, racial disorder, an imperiled environment, scandals in high places, Black September, the specter always of thermonuclear holocaust. The children were bound to get wind of it eventually and to respond more or less like everybody else. The world is, among other things, so vast, dark, and disheveled that whether you're 16 or 60, the temperature is always to turn from it to what is bright, small, bright, and tidy. Stars, for instance, Sagittarius, Capricorn, Aquarius. It's no accident that in much of our society now, the stars are looked to for guidance. These things follow one another in stately syntax and make a kind of sense of things. They don't make it any easier to live with fools and knaves, but at least they purport to explain why they are as they are. They don't make you master of your destiny, but at least they give you utterance to what it is going to be, and forewarned is forearmed. Avoid trips by water on Tuesday. On Wednesday, expect a letter that may change your life, or on the island that we live, give your child a name that has the right letters in it, and all will be well. The problem would be if children only had these books. And I think that one thing that is very good about this curriculum and very good about all of imaginative literature is that we have, in the history of our imaginative literature, we have goblins and dragons and ghosts. But we also have the fairy tales. There is that, what we could almost call, rightly so, monster literature. Let's be honest about it. There is a category of that, and there are 30 pages of it in that one book. However, there's something being taught here that is more than the monsters. And in fairy tales, if we put this monster kind of literature that is very much part of our human past together with the fairy tales, we have pictures of hope. And in the stories with the goblins and the ghosts, and in the stories of Cinderella and the 7 ravens, and the sister of the 7 ravens who cuts off a finger, which has been criticized as self-mutilation. Yes, it is self-mutilation, but who shouldn't cut off a finger if that was the only way they could save 7 brothers from damnation? Now that kind of puts things in perspective. Those stories are all ways of getting at the struggles that we face in real life. And they give us tools for talking about those struggles. Now, the problem is that many times what we do is banish these books, but we let the kids read books like The Babysitter's Club, the Sweet Valley High books. We make no complaints about these, and yet our children are reading them every day. We say, oh, these are innocuous. They don't really matter. Well, if you feel that way, there's something else I'd like to read. For people you're going to be reading for the next several months. Harper's Magazine, June 1991, has an article called Reading May Be Harmful for Your Kids. And what he's talking about is not fairy tales. What he's talking about is Sweet Valley High and The Babysitter's Club. And in here, he talks about the appeal of the Babysitter Club books. This fiction, often urban, very gritty, these books offer an angry vision of breakdown, familial, and societal, especially some of the Sweet Valley High books get at things that I don't know if you read them with your children, but you need to because they get at things that are very difficult. They get at things that are deeply wrong in our society, but they get at it in a pap sort of way, in a pablum sort of way, where it's all smeared over and nobody ever is forced to deal with the deep heart of anxiety that is really there. And yet these books have sold on the bestseller list He has the 20 best-selling paperback books of 1990. I'd say about half of these books are Ninja Turtle books. Several of them are babysitters books. And I think there must be a Sweet Valley High. I can't believe that there isn't a Sweet Valley High there, but I don't see it. There are two good things on it, Where the Wild Things Are and Charlotte's Web. What a great comfort that Charlotte's Web is on that list. But to date, he says, there have been more than 70 Sweet Valley High titles published, with more arriving as you read these words. Company handouts claim an astonishing 65 million Sweet Valley High and 43 million babysitter books in print. And then when you count, in addition to that, the spin-off of these in TV advertisements, in toys, in all the little Ninja Turtle paraphernalia that you can buy in the store, there's quite a bit that's happening there. So, what this says to us, and here I'm going to jump, since it's 3 minutes 12, right into what I wanted, the things that I want to pull together. What this says to us is that we need to be very careful to take a good, hard look, not a superficial one that says, oh, it has a goblin, close the book. Flannery O'Connor, who was a Catholic writer, once talked about Christians who open up a book and discover a leg and an arm and promptly close it. And I think sometimes we do that with imaginative literature. We discover a goblin or a witch and we close it right then and there. But we need to take time to read those stories and see what they are really saying. And even to be aware that chance may not be a horrible thing. So we need to keep reading what our children read. We need to keep talking, and that's what's so good about what's happening here. We need to keep talking with each other, with our children, with the teachers. They need our support desperately because they are being forced to answer by this curriculum. This curriculum is forcing them to answer some huge questions, and they need our help. We need to be very, very careful that we aren't cutting ourselves off and cutting our children off from the roots of our own culture. Because what we're dealing with in this curriculum is the roots of imagination. We're dealing with our cultural roots, whether we have read these stories or not. They are part of our cultural heritage. And children will find out about these roots, or they will have to deal with the problems and this inner struggles that they will have as human beings without the roots that our culture has traditionally given them.